Recording in progress.
I'm going to show you how you're going to cite Shakespeare. So your teacher has asked you to write a paragraph responding to something in Shakespeare, something that you've read. Perhaps it was Macbeth, perhaps the Tempest. Maybe in a future class you're going to have to write a paper or respond in writing form to a question about a book that you're reading or a play that you're reading that Shakespeare has written. There are certain rules for how to do that, and most literature teachers, whether high school or college, are going to use MLA. It's what you've used if you've written anything before for me. Inside your writing handbook is a whole handout on how to cite Shakespeare, but I'm going to walk briefly through with you on how you can do this. This will be a short video, but please hold on to the information I gave you and match it up with the handbook so that you're citing properly when you write. If I can advance the screen here. There we go. Okay, so let's say I've asked you to move this box out of the way here. Let's say I've asked you to provide a quote, some evidence, if you will, in a paragraph. For example, I asked you if Ferdinand and Miranda's love is real. They fall instantly in love upon seeing each other. Is this true love? Now, whether your answer is yes, it is, or no, it isn't, you're going to have to use some evidence from your reading to support that. So you're going to go straight to the play to look for something that defends your answer. So if my claim is that Ferdinand does fall in love with Miranda at first sight, I have to find a quote to support that. So as I look through the book, The Tempest, that's where I'm drawing this from, and I go to Act 3, Scene 1, and lines 76 to 79, this is what Ferdinand says. The very instant that I saw you, did my heart fly to your service. There resides to make me slave to it, and for your sake am I this patient logman. So in your reading, you see Ferdinand carrying all these logs. Miranda's father is making him work. He is putting him to the test. And Ferdinand, who's been a prince his entire life, who's used to everyone doing work for him, is now working for Miranda. He loves her so much, he will carry logs all day long. So this quote perfectly supports that Ferdinand falls in love with Miranda at first sight. But that's only the first section. I found a quote. Now, how do I put that quote in my writing? What does that look like? Now, the first thing before we talk about how do we put that in our writing, I do want you to visually see that Shakespeare writes in two different formats. Mostly, he's going to write in poetry, that iambic pentameter template, if you will. If you just kind of take your book and fan through it, you're going to see that most of the lines look like they do on the left. So I'm just going to ask you to make a visual distinction between what you see on the left and what you see on the right. So on the left, look at how the lines end. Do you notice that they mostly are not lined up, if you will? Shakespeare's writing in that form, iambic pentameter. And so the lines, they end after you get to the structure of that iambic pentameter. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Let's see if that works with Ferdinand's language. The very instant that I saw you did, my heart fly to your service there resides, to make me slave to it, and for your sake am I this patient logman. Now notice, this is just a freebie here. That last line doesn't fit the iambic pentameter, but look what Shakespeare does. Miranda says, "Do you love me?" She finishes that iambic pentameter. That's kind of cool. So Ferdinand's last line is like half of the iambic pentameter, and Miranda finishes it. Am I this patient logman? And I think Shakespeare might be trying to force that into one sound there. Do you love me? So kind of beautiful there. Anyway, that's poetry. That's poetry. It's following the rules of iambic pentameter. And if you flip through your book, you're going to see that poetry is everywhere. And that's mostly what Shakespeare is writing in. Now, sometimes the characters are going to step out of the poetry. Typically, Shakespeare's characters that are lower characters, right? They're going to speak in just regular sentences. Like we don't walk around talking in poetry or in poetic shapes. We just use regular sentences. And if you look on the right-hand side, this is a completely different page. It's a separate picture. Look at the bosun. His lines here. None that I more love than myself. You are a counselor. If you can command these elements to silence and work the peace of the present, we will not hand a rope more. Notice the ending of the lines here. It's not poetry. This is just regular good old prose. That means that the rules, whoops, I advanced the slide too fast. There we go. The rules of just regular sentencing apply. You're going to keep typing until you get to the end of the line. And so visually this looks different, and then structurally it's different because it's not poetry. Why in the world do I tell you that? Because if you're using a quote from Shakespeare, if it's poetry, you have to use certain rules. And this quote that I've underlined is what I'm going to use, and it's poetry. So I'm going to use these rules. Now, you only need to leave these or disobey this rule, I guess, if you will, if you're quoting something that's just prose, a sentence. But mostly you'll be quoting poetry probably if you're using a quote from Shakespeare. So how do I do that? How do I embed that quote into my writing? How do I put it in there? How do I plant it into my writing so that it's just not abrupt and weird and doesn't make any sense? I want it to make sense. So how can I best use that quote? Well, the very first thing I'm going to do is use a lead-in phrase. I've said this before. We talked about this last year. This is not brand new, but many of you are leaving off these lead-in phrases, and they are so important. What I've highlighted here, that's the lead-in phrase. Look how small it is. Look at it. It's just 2 words. That's all it is. But it serves a function. It sets up the quote. Otherwise, if I left it off, I would just have this quote dropped in the middle of my writing, and as a reader, I don't totally understand what you're doing. So let's take a look. How do I use this lead-in phrase? I started with a sentence just to kind of as an appetizer, if you will, for what I'm going to say. Ferdinand's love for Miranda is immediate. He declares, and then I'm going to include a comma. There are several ways that you can use a lead-in phrase. And if you look in your writing handbook, you're going to see it. I have a whole page in there on how to embed a quote into your writing. And you could use a signal phrase, a colon. You could use a speaker's name. Like this could say Ferdinand declares, but I already mentioned Ferdinand in the first sentence, so that would seem redundant. So if you're confused on how to embed a quote in your writing, use your writing handbook. It's all there. All right, so my lead-in phrase is, he declares, comma, and then my quote is going to start, so of course I use quotation marks. The very instant that I saw you did. Now what is that weird slash there? That's called a line break, because if you're looking at your book, line 76 ends with did. And so I'm going to put a space, a line break, a space, and then my heart. Why is my capitalized? Because it's the start of the next line of poetry. So it gets capitalized. So basically, if you're looking at your book, which I suggest, open up to Act 3, Scene 1, look at these lines by Ferdinand. Shakespeare capitalizes it because it's poetry. My heart, fly to your service, comma, there resides. So resides is the end of the line in the book. And so, of course, I'm going to do a space, a line break, a space. And then the very next line starts with to make me a slave to it. And I'm going to capitalize to because it's the first line of poetry. And for your sake, that's all one line. So the line ends after sake. So I'm going to do a space, a line break. And then the next line says, am I this patient logman? And am is capitalized because it's that first line of poetry in line 79. So I'm going to use a lead-in phrase, he declares, and then I'm going to use my quote. And since I showed you that it's poetry, I need to use line breaks when the line ends. All right, so when I include that textual citation, I need to cite it somehow. And we've done that before. We've cited quotes. And there's a few rules about how to cite Shakespeare. And I'll try to just keep it really, really simple. If you were to write a paper where you're comparing Macbeth to the Tempest and you're going back and forth and using quotes from different books, there's a specific way to quote that. But for our purposes, you're just going to respond to the Tempest in this essay that's coming up or in this question that I've asked you for a CQE. And so this is how you'll use it. I gave a setup, he declares, right? That's my little phrase I'm going to use to let my reader know, here comes a quote. And then my quote, the very instant that I saw you, did my heart fly to your service. There resides to make me slave to it, and for your sake am I this patient logman. Now, at the end of my quote, I am only going to use this end punctuation mark. I'm going to save my punctuation until after I do my citation. And you've learned this before. There's an exception. If it ends in a question or ends in an exclamation point, that would go here. However, this doesn't. It ends in a period. So my quote's going to end like this. And inside the parenthetical citation, inside the parentheses, I'm going to use Shakespeare's name, so Shakespeare. And then I don't have to write out a whole bunch of words. Act 3, Scene 2, Scene 1, line 76. I don't have to do any of that. It's a pretty universal rule when you're quoting Shakespeare. You use the number for the act, so that's 3, a period. Then you want to tell the scene, so this is Act 3, Scene 1, and then a period. And then the line numbers that I'm quoting. These line numbers are 76 to 79. Do you see that this is much simpler than writing out the words act, scene, and lines? There's one thing that I don't want you to get tripped up on when you write your essay. Let's say you put a quote in every single paragraph and they're all from the Tempest. You've already established in your first quote that the writer is Shakespeare. And so in all subsequent quotes, so a quote from the play in paragraph 2, after you've already quoted Shakespeare, guess what? You don't have to list his name. That really only needs to appear the first time. If you're writing a CQE, then you would write his name. If you're writing an essay and you get to your first quote, you're going to include his name. Shakespeare, Act 1, Scene 3, line 105. But every other paragraph that uses a quote from the play, the same play, by Shakespeare, you don't need to keep saying his name because your writer knows Shakespeare wrote The Tempest. You've already established that. Once you've established something, in terms of citation, you don't have to keep referring to it, if that makes sense. If you have questions about that, feel free to chime in and ask those questions in class. I just wanted to make sure that you can see visually what it looks like to quote a Shakespeare quote and the difference between quoting the poetic form of Shakespeare and the prose form of Shakespeare. Don't be scared if you can't quite figure that out. The biggest clue I can tell you is look at how the line ends. If it's jagged, like it's not justified necessarily, that's probably poetry. If it all lines up, if you just flip your book over to page 103 and look at Trinculo's lines about the middle of the page, you'll see a total difference between how Trinculo's lines are set up and the poetry above that Caliban uses. It goes all the way to the end and they line up, they're justified. So that's your visual difference between whether or not you need to use those line breaks or not. One more thing before we go, use your writing handbook. There are several pages of how to quote and specifically how to quote Shakespeare. So just make use of that. You don't have to memorize this. Refer to your handbook now. You're accountable for this information because you have it. So from this point on, when you quote from Shakespeare, you need to be using lead-in phrases and use those citation rules. All right, God bless, and we'll see you in class.